All right, well, thanks everyone. Just to sort of frame and orient this conversation with Dr. Molly Worthen from UNC Chapel Hill and Jonah Goldberg from AEI and the Dispatch, we basically have in mind a conversation about charisma in political and religious leaders alike, about its sort of unique history here. Molly's book, a wonderful book, Spellbound, which I think some of you have seen, goes back 400 years, talks about the LDS church, talks about sort of strains in different religious communities, the Puritans, Judaism in America, and more. And we're hoping that this, like this morning, can be sort of a big think dialogue. So I think mostly just want to introduce briefly our speakers, and then away they go. Our thinking is that Molly will go first, and Jonah will go second, and then we'll flip it to you. We'll take a little coffee break in the middle, as before. But away we go for the chance, a rare chance as it is, to go deep dive. So Molly is a history prof at UNC Chapel Hill. She's won a number of writing awards over the years. Her new book, Spellbound, which is like 400 pages, covers like 400 years.
It's definitely longer than 400 pages.
Is it really? Okay.
Come on.
I actually lent my copy to my wonderful wife, so she's reading it right now, and I didn't put it in my bag, so I couldn't check it. But you're gonna learn a lot. She's won the Mannequin Family Award. She writes for the Times. She writes for the Atlantic. She writes for the New Yorker. And I think her theme this morning and the question she raised about sort of how much of life, like, yearns to sort of fill a spiritual void, comes through in the book, and maybe even in personal story. We'll see where we go. I heard Molly speak at Faith Angle in 2016 when she talked with Mike Cromarty at the very first one that I ever went to as a funder. I was sitting in Jeremy's chair back then, and it was wonderful to hear her talk about sort of Trump and prospects and possibilities and concerns. And it was a great talk. Jonah Goldberg is the senior fellow at AEI. He's the Asness chair there. He co-founded the Dispatch, where he is the editor-in-chief. He is a CNN commentator. He wrote a great book called Suicide of the West a few years ago, and writes for a bunch of outlets as well. So thanks, friends, for coming. Molly, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. It is such an honor. It's so fun to be with you all. I really enjoyed this morning, and I think we'll probably find that there are some themes that surface again. I just relish the chance to get to share with you some of what I've been thinking through over the past decade or so. So Josh asked me to prepare 25 minutes of comments to sort of distill the big arguments of my book, and then we can go from there. My plan is just to tell you about a way of thinking about charisma that has helped me pull together some patterns across American history and in our own time. And I want to suggest that to understand politics, it's really important to keep theology front and center. And we shouldn't keep the history of Pentecostals speaking in tongues over here and the history of secular political movements over there, because they are actually one story. When I started this project, almost 10 years ago, I confused charisma with charm. I thought I would be writing about a lot of really charming people with high emotional intelligence who are really good at working a room. I also associated charisma with amazing public speaking. And it is true that charm and impressive oratory do show up in the characters I found myself writing about, but much more in the breach than in the broader pattern of things. I realized that the key giveaway of charisma is its deeply polarizing effect on people. So charismatic leaders have a lot of people who adore them and a lot of people who loathe them, and not many who are just lukewarm. So let me give you the definition that I finally settled on. Charisma is a relationship between a leader and followers based on telling a story. A charismatic leader invites followers into a compelling narrative that does a better job of making sense of their lives than the other stories currently on offer in the culture. But for people outside the story, it is totally baffling and maybe even revolting. I've noticed that when we're on the outside of a charismatic relationship, A lot of us, even totally secular people, resort to quasi-religious or hypnotism metaphors. We talk about a leader mesmerizing or magnetizing, converting followers to a cause. I think that's because charisma is a concept that we punt to when we can't figure out a totally rational, material, kind of quid pro quo explanation for a relationship between leaders and followers. There's something else going on, and we don't understand it. This is why the sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term charisma from the world of biblical studies and church history a little bit more than 100 years ago. The Greek term, originally charis, means chosenness by the gods. In the New Testament, Paul uses the word charisma to mean slightly different things in different contexts, but basically it means supernatural, unbidden gift of grace from God. And Weber is really the one who deserves credit for coining the term as we use it in colloquial speech outside of sort of church contexts today, to describe a kind of authority that is distinct from the authority a leader might get by virtue of his or her position in an institution or vis-a-vis tradition, having a big military. Charisma is an authority that has to do with the leader convincing followers that he or she has accomplished some supernatural feat. This is Weber's definition. Or has some amazing supernatural power that at least partly resides in a special way in the leader as a person. To me, the phenomenon that Weber and secular observers after him tried to name with this word, this repurposed version of charisma, is actually not all that far from the supernatural thing that Paul named in the New Testament. Because in both the religious and the more secular sense, what charisma is really about is the human desire to be in contact with otherworldly power and to seek a place in a big transcendent narrative that lends meaning to our lives and gives us some sense that it's all going somewhere. Even if we're not entirely in control, we have a sense of the game plan. And whether you find a charismatic leader compelling or revolting, I think, depends on whether he's offering you an attractive part in the story that he's telling. I want to add a caveat, though. When I call a leader's message a story, I am not saying that it's necessarily fiction. Humans are storytelling creatures. This is how we organize information about the world. The difference between a charismatic leader who is an agent of moral progress and one who is not has everything to do with whether the story he or she is telling is grounded in reality, whether the leader is inviting followers into a new way of organizing what they know about the world and maybe seeing themselves in it, called to an active role in a new way. On the other hand, there are leaders who are fabulists, who are pulling back a veil on a pseudo-reality. But charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. I think this way of approaching charismatic leadership, thinking about it as transcendent storytelling, might help with a problem that I think those of us who have been trying to make sense of religion, whether as scholars or journalists or both, have been dealing with for a few decades now. And this came up in the panel this morning. Whether or not we can talk about how to make sense of the Christian renewal that seems to be happening in a modest way. But I think the broad trends, right, have been kind of going in one direction, which is this steady decline in the usual sort of markers that observers have relied on for decades as shorthand for like telling us something about what's going on with the religious impulse in the West, right? We've correlated it or tried to, assumed there's a correlation between that impulse and church attendance and so forth, right? But we know that those polls are not capturing what they used to. We've got this growing number, something like 28% of people who reject all religious affiliation, although half of them say that they're spiritual but not religious, right? What does that mean? So the question to me is the normal methods that we've used to get a handle on this are just not capturing as much as perhaps they once did. And maybe we always exaggerated how meaningful it was. So the question then is, where should we look? I think it's a mistake to assume that just because fewer people spend some part of their weekend in a house of worship, that means that the religious impulse is evaporating. So if it's not landing there, where is it landing? I think one place it's fruitful to look is in the relationship between certain leaders and their followers. So I thought I would tell you just a little bit about the later part of my book that is most immediately connected to our current political moment. I want to look at a particular kind of charismatic appeal that seems to have real power now, especially in the United States, and think about what it has to do with our need for religious experience and authority. Let me start with just the basic question of how Americans get their information and develop a narrative of what's happening in the world, because that's the broad context for any leader who comes in with a new story to tell about it. We have tons of poll data saying that Americans have really low trust in institutions, right? Like the lowest it's ever been across the board in every category of institution, from Congress to legacy news media to higher ed, even the military, right? Now, why is this important for the story of charisma? Because those polls tell us about one category of leader that definitely lacks charisma right now, and that's experts. Institutions tend to be full of experts. They're staffed by experts. They're in the business of training experts. They are premised on the idea that you need approval from more senior experts in your field in order to deserve the faith of the public on whatever the issue is. That whole idea seems to have fallen apart. I want to suggest that the era immediately preceding our own, so 1945 until the late 1960s, set us up for this in some special ways. That earlier era is a period when respect for professional expertise, the charisma of experts, confidence in the story that experts tell about the world, you could say, when it reached a peak and then began to collapse. And then in our own time, we've seen the rise of a different type of charismatic leader, a type I call the guru. Now, what's a guru? Number one, a guru tells you to put your trust in him or her as an individual. They may link themselves to an institution or a tradition or scripture, but they position themselves as the best interpreter. Second, a guru presents a totalizing worldview. If you accept the assumptions he or she presents, you have answers for every big question about right and wrong and the ultimate goals in life. Third, the worldview is based on an alternative reality, a new set of facts that are at odds with what outsiders see. And number four, gurus usually operate adjacent to electoral politics rather than right in it, although sometimes they do make the leap. Before I say more about the guru, I want to talk a little bit about the age of the expert. The period from 1945 to the late 60s was the heyday of cultural authority for secular scientific expertise in North America, right? So think of higher education booming after World War II, lots of federal investment in research. Later, the technocrats working for John F. Kennedy on economic policy, on the Vietnam War, pitching the new frontier to Americans, this story that said, invest in expert-led innovation, expert-designed foreign policy, and we will spread American democracy, raise the standards of living, we will get to the moon. I'll add that the 50s and the early 60s were the last period when you could say that traditional religious institutions that had historically had a lot of cultural dominance, call them religious experts, were really in charge as well. So meaning this is the last era when liberal Protestant mainline churches were thriving, at least by the numbers. Those denominations basically peaked in 1965 and have really crashed in their membership numbers since then. So just one data point, the United Methodist Church had about 11 million members in 1965, now has something like 6 million. And yes, despite the population growth, of course, and is losing about 200,000 annually. Another trend I want to flag in the post-war era is the beginning of the charismatic renewal movement, which was an explosion of the New Testament kind of charisma, Holy Spirit charisma, in churches that had never seen anything like this before, at least not in the miraculous sensory way. Hands up in the air, people getting slain in the Spirit, speaking in tongues. These revivals spread around the world, and in some ways, charismatic renewal did breathe a new vitality into some established churches. One of the key early nodes is like middle-class Episcopalians in Los Angeles. Catholic churches worldwide embrace this. At the same time, I think you could argue that charismatic renewal chipped away at traditional religious institutions, like revivals often do, I think, and over the long term emboldened independent, non-denominational megachurch pastors, religious entrepreneurs, rather than older, more established groups and denominations. You probably also associate the 50s and 60s with the rise of the counterculture, a movement certainly driven by skepticism toward institutions. My point is that by the 1960s, we have a complicated picture. The experts, the educated establishment church leaders still seem somewhat comfortable in their cultural authority, but that's starting to erode. Let me give you a snapshot at the end of this period, when that erosion is giving way to full-on collapse. This was a moment in my research when I really saw the value of putting the narrative of mainstream political history alongside the history of supernatural religious movements that scholars usually try to separate from the more respectable stuff. So let's zoom in one place in time, 1970, Southern California, specifically UCLA. Picture Angela Davis striding across campus. She's 26 years old. She's a proud member of the Communist Party. She's just coming off a stint in Germany doing graduate work in Marxist philosophy. She came back to the States to get involved with the Black Panthers, and UCLA has hired her to teach a few classes while she finishes her dissertation. She likes to teach in a miniskirt. Her natural hairstyle frames her face in a perfect sphere, and she packs in the students. I mean, they love her. Even after she dismisses class, they hang around by the podium, working up the courage to ask her a question. Protesters hang around too. Middle-aged Czech refugees, members of the local chapter of Young Americans for Freedom. Ronald Reagan is the governor of California at this time. So he's on the UC Board of Regents, ex officio, and they are trying to get Davis fired. There are death threats. She has to get a bodyguard. So what's the story she's telling? Well, from one angle, it's the classic Marxist arc of history, the story of the coming class war. But Davis is also pitching legions of students on a story about institutions. She has worked, as many of them have, to get into the heart of the ivory tower as a PhD student. And she is really quite brilliantly using academia's own platforms to declare the whole system illegitimate. Okay, now just a short walk away from the UCLA philosophy classrooms, you'd find a very different scene in an old frat house. The frat boys are gone. It's been taken over by a group called the Jesus Christ Light and Power Company. This is a Christian commune run by a former Campus Crusade worker named Hal Lindsey. He's usually in a tank top, blue jeans, leather boots, talking to college kids in his Texas drawl about the Antichrist and the coming rapture. It's 1970, so he has just published his famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which is all about the coming apocalypse. This frat house is an outpost of the Jesus People movement, which is a mix of disillusioned hippies and middle-class kids fleeing their parents' churches. It's a movement that in many ways grew out of established institutions, but it loathes those institutions. So here's Lindsay talking to a reporter. He says, these kids hate impersonalness, bigness, irrelevance, materialism. And I've just given you a description of the average institutional church. Now, I'm not saying that the Jesus freaks and the student activists rallying for Angela Davis are one unified movement. But I am saying that the Jesus people seeking the Holy Spirit and the charismatic relationship that Angela Davis has with her followers are on a continuum. They are related responses to the same cultural situation. They share a sense of being fed up with the cosmos. They've been shaped by institutions that have let them down. They're hungry for a new eschatology, a promise of how all this injustice is going to get sorted out. There's a way in which it's these young people shaped by working inside institutions but feeling betrayed by them who help tear down the authority of universities and the authority of mainstream churches. I think it makes sense that the late 60s and 1970s were also an age of new religious movements, ranging from the infamous and scary ones like Jim Jones' People's Temple to cases that were sometimes benign and sometimes kind of cult-like the evangelical charismatic Children of Love, Guru Maharaji's Divine Light Mission. These movements varied tremendously in theology and practice, but they all orbited around a guru, a charismatic leader who could look at you and make you feel seen. Like all your hidden problems are now out in the open, acknowledged as real and serious, and they are part of a bigger narrative. They mean something if you're willing to come along and see how the world really works. Also, I'll just flag the cliches of the era, right? The Vietnam War, Watergate. By the time we're in the 70s, the decline of mainline church attendance is unmistakable. Scholars like to zoom out and call this big picture secularization. To me, secularization is not the decline of the religious impulse. It's the eroding trust in institutions in general, not just religious institutions, and the transfer of that religious impulse somewhere else. By the time we get to the 1980s, the guru is not just a leadership model that you see on the margins. The guru is a model of authority that has taken off in the self-help industry, in leadership studies programs at business schools. I mean, Zvika was sort of alluding to this, I think, when he talked about the cultural pattern of outsourcing meaning to the workplace. But it's in the 80s when the trendy message in leadership studies contexts comes to be that your boss is your coach who is coming alongside you to help you become your most authentic self and find spiritual fulfillment in the mission of your company. There's also the interesting mix of self-help and televangelism that you see in Oprah Winfrey, who is just coming to national prominence. Her show gets syndicated nationally in 1986. And I'd argue you also see hints of it in the brash New York businessman who goes on Oprah's show a couple of times and muses about running for president, Donald Trump. Two things make charismatic leaders more compelling, maybe you want to argue more dangerous, in our current era. In the past, institutions and traditions were stronger and provided some counterweight, an alternative context, a source of identity in which people could evaluate the story that a leader was offering them. Second, The cultural authority of organized religion has been on retreat for 2 generations. This has fed both a crisis of meaning and a tendency to transfer religious impulses and sort of hope for ultimate ends to politics. But it has also fed a crisis of confidence among the lay people and leaders who have stuck with the traditional churches. When you are feeling insecure about your control of the culture, you're going to be extra vulnerable to a leader who shows up promising you political power, promising you a comeback. The history of charismatic leaders in this country and their influence now only becomes legible, I think, if we're willing to pose theological questions. What is the transcendent narrative this leader is offering? What does salvation look like? How has this leader transformed the feeling of tribe into the feeling of being a holy remnant? And we should think about the Christian renewal that came up this morning in this context too. So we're seeing Pentecostal and Holy Spirit-oriented Catholic and Anglican churches. It's important that it's these kinds of churches growing among young people across the West. But what might we learn if we entertain the possibility that secular and religious people aren't so different, and that the contact with supernatural order and power that these converts are seeking has at least a family resemblance to the promise of transcendence that you find in some varieties of politics, on the left and the right. Max Weber is one of my heroes, and I think I am channeling him a little bit when I say that secular scholars and journalists need theology, not to assert dogmatic prescriptions, but to pose the right questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. Wonderful. Jonah Goldberg.
Okay, that was great. I'm a big fan of Molly's. We had a lot of fun on my podcast. I'm really loving her book. I've taken lots of notes as she talked, and I don't know how responsive I'll be. Thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person.
Our loss. Good to see you.
I am not. You can hear me?
You bet. You bet.
Okay. I am not, as a pseudo-intellectual demi-Jew from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I am not fully fluent in the various denominational conflicts of American Christianity, although I think I'm above average, which is sad commentary on what constitutes average in America. So I want to respond to this in a sort of a slightly different way. My last book, part of my argument was that liberal democratic capitalism and that whole bundle of things that we associate with it are fundamentally unnatural. If they were natural, they would have showed up a little earlier in the evolutionary record. Human rights, I think, stemmed largely, we would not have a conception of human rights in the West but for Christianity. But even so, it took a long time for the internal logics of Christianity to help us develop those sorts of concepts. And I don't mean this as a criticism of liberal democratic capitalism. What has two thumbs and loves liberal democratic capitalism? This guy. But, lots of things are unnatural that I think are great, like air conditioning, dentistry, all sorts of stuff. The problem is, because they're not natural, they don't come to us naturally, by which I mean they are not the structures and mechanisms of we'll just call it democracy now, though I think liberal democratic capitalism is different than just democracy qua democracy, but it gets really toothy to say liberal democratic capitalism over and over again. Because democracy is not natural, we tend not to think in those terms that are central to it. It requires an enormous amount of civic education and commitment to things that are unnatural. This is one of the things that early Christianity really understood about turning down worldliness, not giving in to temptation, and all that I think we have forgotten in the era of Romanticism, which I don't think has ended. It began, 200, 300 years ago, and we just call it different things. But this cult of authenticity, of being true to yourself, is essentially a fundamentally romantic understanding of things, that the inner light of your authentic self is the best guide to things. And we hear this all the time. It is one of the worst forms of moral education that parents often do, of just telling kids, well, look, just be true to yourself, go with your instincts. That is not good advice for a parent, and it's not good advice for a democracy. And so one of the things that Molly points to, and I think she's absolutely right about this, I've written about this a bunch in the past, is that one of the places that we go to with our natural impulses is to talk about things in the realm of religion. And we put a patina of religion and religious thinking over all sorts of things that are not necessarily explicitly religious, because it helps us. It's the spoonful of sugar that lets some things, go down. There are other things that serve this same function. War. It is amazing once you start scratching at it how much of our political conversation is mobilized through martial metaphors. Battleground states, air campaigns, you can go down a very long list. I've written a bunch of columns along these lines, because that is just something that we intuitively kind of grok better than these actual sort of things. Another one is family. One of the formulations, I used to win applause from the right for pointing out how stupid it was to refer to, as Chris Rock did, Barack Obama as America's dad. It's no less stupid calling Donald Trump America's dad. I give George Washington a pass because the father of our country thing is a little different given his role in the founding of this country. But there is this incessant effort in politics, often from the left, increasingly from the right, to talk about Americans as if we're members of one family. We are not members of one family. There is an entire cascade of ideas and impulses that flow from the assumption that you're part of a family. But as Hayek would argue, with his talk about the microcosm and the macrocosm, or the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft, we have completely different rules for family versus non-family. They're sort of the core of the us versus them logic of tribalism. But they're also just sort of different. If your nephew comes to your door in the middle of the night soaking wet because his car broke down and says, hey, can I stay here? Or I lost my job, can I sleep on the couch for a couple weeks? You might say no, but you probably wouldn't, because he's family. If a total stranger did the same thing, you wouldn't. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It might say something about your Christianity, but that's a different point. The point is just simply we have different rules. I often tell people that in my family, I'm a communist. Because in your family, it is from each according to his ability to each according to their need. You don't charge your favorite son, you don't give better food to your favorite son and really short shrift the one who's a pain in the ass. You don't charge your kids rent. You don't put price tags on the food in your fridge. It is a different set of rules. But the great thing about the liberal democratic extended order is that it creates a system by which we can deal in non-zero-sum ways with strangers, and that's great. But when we confuse politics for family, it empowers the state, it justifies all sorts of things that shouldn't be justified, and it confuses matters, because at the end of the day, 335 million people can't all be your brothers or sisters. When Barack Obama used to go around saying that the central goal of the state is scriptural insofar as we are our brother's keeper, first of all, he's kind of mangling the story of Cain and Abel quite a bit. But second of all, the state isn't our keeper. And we are not beasts to be kept. But there are other terms. Sports is full of, politics is full of sports stuff, which is really sort of war metaphors by proxy. Is a fascination of mine is how much sports is actually infused with war talk. Ask most normal Americans about the phrase over the top. They think it's a football term, but football borrowed it from World War I, because that's what you did when you went over the trenches. And then there's, of course, science. Science is one which Molly touched on, where we basically, sort of to borrow from Ernest Gellner, we've had a history, particularly since the middle of the 20th century, of treating scientists as if they are extra democratic, extra political. When I mean extra, I mean outside of. They're non-political, they're non-democratic, essentially secular priests that we defer to about what is right and wrong. You know, Hayek would condemn that as scientism. I think one of the places that Weber comes in a little bit is, and Molly's thesis is, you know, when Weber talks about the disenchantment of the world, what he's talking about is stripping it of these mystical, charismatic, in effect, you know, charmed meanings. And the problem with that, not to get too Chestertonian, is that when you do that, you actually, when you start when you start using the language of mysticism and religion for things that are not mystical and religious, you actually make them mystical and religious. And one of my favorite quotes on this was from the philosopher Eric Voegelin. I promise I'm not going to read from much, but I cannot commit this one to memory. Voegelin has this great line where he says, "When God is invisible behind the world, the contents of the world will become new gods. When the symbols of transcendent religiosity are banned, new symbols develop from the inner worldly language of science to take their place. Like the Christian ecclesia, the inner world community has its apocalypse too, yet the new apocalyptics insist that the symbols they create are scientific judgments." And I think that this sort of cult of the expert, you know, we saw how badly that could serve us during the COVID pandemic and how much resentment, once the sort of emperor has no clothes realization kicked in. And the last thing, which I agree with Molly entirely about, is simply stories rightly understood. We are storytelling creatures. Our brains were wired to understand things through stories. Most of the great narratives of the ancient world began as oral histories because written words came a lot later. And we are still sort of wired that way to understand things through narratives. And one of the best examples of this was George Shultz used to tell this story about how he visited Ronald Reagan once, and he had to, because he wanted to get his opinion on a big speech that he had to do. And he asked Reagan what he thought of the speech, and Reagan said, "It's a good speech. It's not the speech I would give, but it's a good speech." He says, "Well, what do you mean?" And he says, "Well, here's what I would do, is I would do point 1, story, point 2, story, point 3, story. Tell people stories." Reagan, in his campaign speeches and stump speeches, very rarely talked about Republicans and Democrats. He told little moral stories about people, and he aligned himself with the morals of the story. And that was a very effective, one would say, you know, charismatic, at least in the conventional way, of doing politics. And I wish we had more of that. One of the things that infuriates me, and I've been consistent on this long before Trump, is that whatever you think about immigration policy, it is folly for the right, for conservatives, to just get completely on the wrong side of the immigration story. The idea of people yearning to be free, yearning to search for the American dream, escaping tyranny, escaping poverty, to come here and make something out of their lives and provide a better life for their kids, is a fantastic story that's central to the American identity. And to get on the wrong side of that, and to claim that anybody who does that is in effect, you know, unwanted or even a criminal, I just find grotesque. And the inevitable consequence of that rhetoric was, I don't know if it was inevitable, the consequence of that rhetoric was in part the candidacy of Donald Trump in 2016. For years I used to tell people used to ask me when I give speeches what my preferred immigration policy was, and I said, well, it's to have one. And then defend it. But as we at National Review said for years, back when I was at National Review, is that if responsible politicians don't deal with immigration responsibly, irresponsible politicians will fill the void and pick it up as a winning issue. And I think that explains as much as anything else does Donald Trump. And so to get it back to the actual issue of politics, which again I know a little bit more about than religion, is I agree entirely with Molly that the inability to see human beings' hunger for meaning, hunger for transcendence, hunger for, I hate the cliche, cause larger than themselves, but there's truth to it. The ability to see that is one of the main drivers of the dysfunction of American politics these days. And you can see so one of the things that Weber writes about in Politics as a Vocation, which I blame Molly for making me reread, is his concept of plebiscitary democracy. Right? And in plebiscitary democracy, the charismatic leader is able to transcend conventional institutions and become, in effect, an avatar of the people. Or, the word pleb is where you get plebiscitary democracy. You become the tribune of the plebs. And your ability to overpower, through your popularity, the proper functioning of a liberal democracy becomes manifest. And it's really kind of remarkable when you read Politics as a Vocation, how much Trump fits the paradigm. One of the reasons why, not to do too much rank punditry, but one of the reasons why Trump was able to win in 2016 and why Bernie Sanders almost was, is that the parties are so unbelievably weak and can no longer function as the kind of elite gatekeepers that they once did. You got a situation where a charismatic leader, and I think both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are charismatic leaders, could use mass media, which is another major part of the sort of the Politics as Vocation thesis, could use mass media to just simply go over the heads of gatekeepers. And I watched in awe in 2016 when we wrote our Against Trump issue at National Review, where we basically, going into the Iowa caucuses, we said, we're not telling you who to vote for, we're just editorially endorsing essentially the field over Trump. And you can disagree with that. Obviously, it didn't work. My friend Rich Lowry, who was the editor at the time, regrets the issue. I don't, but I understand why he does for institutional reasons. But I was just dumbstruck by the number of people on Fox News, where I was still a contributor, who would say, deadpan, including people like Chris Wallace, like people from the news side, sober, nerdy, types, not pro-Trump type. Who was National Review to tell voters who to vote for? I mean, it was said over and over again over the course of 48 hours or something when the issue came out. And I felt like I was taking crazy pills. You know who National Review was? National friggin' Review. National Review had been telling people who to vote for 50 years. We endorsed candidates, we didn't endorse candidates, we endorsed candidates for the primary, but not for the general. We withheld endorsements for all sorts of things. It is like one of the reasons why God put National Review on this planet is to offer opinions about politicians. But this ethos, this populist ethos of how dare anybody pretend that their opinion matters if it runs counter to, the Volksgemeinschaft or whatever we want to call it, was so widespread that even people who did not like Trump had incorporated it into their analysis about why this was somehow beyond the pale. And I think we're still living downstream of that moment. And we can see it in very mainstream politics. Look, the idea of, so plebiscitary democracy is this idea that some tribune of the people can incarnate the popular will in a way, or at least the popular will of the people among whom that candidate is popular, because I think Molly's right that charismatic leaders by definition sort of piss off people as much as they enthrall them. But it's this idea that there are no legitimate obstacles to their will. As it says, as the guy says, as Stark says in All King's Men, your will is my justice, right? It is this idea that it should trump everything. And that is the way Donald Trump behaves in politics across a whole bunch of places. It is amazing to me how much, I listed these other realms other than the religious, these other forms of vocabulary, these prisms, these archetypes, these mental mechanisms through which we mediate reality, religion, war, family, and all that kind of stuff. Trump lives almost entirely in those. I mean, this is a guy, when he was asked whether he would support Article 1 of the Constitution, he said, oh, Article 1, Article 2, Article 12, I'm going to support them all. There is no Article 12. He doesn't know anything about the Constitution. And even religion, which I think at the level of symbol, and part of the thing about being a charismatic figure is that people impose their priors on the charismatic figure. So that's why you get all these dumb memes of Jesus, standing behind the Resolute desk with Trump, or Jesus and Satan arm wrestling to see who's going to win the 2016 election. It's not Trump making arguments about that, but he invites that from lots of people. The one place where I think if you're going to cover the religion of Donald Trump in fruitful ways, it has almost nothing to do with biblical Christianity. When he was asked what his favorite biblical passage was, he said, well, there's so many, but if I had to pick one, I guess it would be an eye for an eye. Which is, I'll let the more Christian, the people more biblically literate parse that. But the prosperity gospel is just a huge part of Donald Trump's upbringing. He was basically raised in the prosperity gospel, and he surrounded himself, at the periphery with a whole bunch of prosperity gospel people, and that's sort of where he is. He speaks in the language of war, of tribe, of nationalism. Nationalism is another one of these, what Ernest Gellner, I guess, would call enchanting creeds, these charismatic prisms by which we impose on things. And in an age of mass media, it is remarkable how well it works for him, given that, and I think, again, Molly's point that you don't necessarily have to be particularly articulate to be a charismatic figure. Charles Gradauer and I used to talk about how when you listen to Trump, it is remarkable how many tics he has of somebody who now has a limited vocabulary. He didn't used to. In the 80s, if you watch him, he could be quite articulate. But what really drove it home for me was when he said in 2016, American blacks have never, ever, 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 ever had it so bad. And it was 7 evers. And that conveys real passion and meaning. It's not particularly erudite or, it is not the sesquipedalianism of William F. Buckley. But it works for him because he is adept at working through these artificial constraints in people. But also, the people's artificial constraints have just all been torn down in all sorts of different ways. And to turn it to actual sort of the actual politics of the moment, when Weber talks about plebiscitary democracy, well, there's also this concept of a plebiscitary mandate. And one of my great peeves in American political discourse is the whole concept of a mandate. Mandates are, to use jargon from social science, bullshit. There is no mention of the word mandate in the Constitution. Every politician who's elected can claim claim a mandate. If you were elected to oppose Donald Trump, you have no less of a mandate than Donald Trump has to do what he wants to do. And yet, the right has incorporated unto itself an argument that historically was more rooted on the left, right? It was Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Jackson who were the ones who really championed this idea that because a president is the only figure elected by all of the people, he therefore has this extra authority to work his will and accomplish his agenda. And it's just not true. The mandate, to the extent there is one, is to do the job, to fulfill the job description as laid out in the Constitution and in your oath of office. And that requires you to work with the Senate and the House, to respect governors, to respect the law. And it is just remarkable to me the degree to which, say, Stephen Miller argues over and over and over again, as if this is an argument that everyone is supposed to know, that because Trump was elected by all of the people, and they always lie and say this massive landslide, he therefore should get his way, even if it violates the Constitution, even if it's illegal, even if it's a breach of separation of powers, because he is imbued by the voice of the people to have his way. And that is a very charismatic, it's what Weber would call Caesarism, and I don't think it's unfair to call it that. And it is remarkably effective and shows you how thin the commitments to liberal democratic capitalism and constitutionalism are among an enormous number of people, including an enormous number of people who were once role models of mine, who insisted that these constructs and these barriers and these guardrails were virtually what defined and made America. But if you have a sufficiently charismatic or a sufficiently powerful leader who is willing to use his power to destroy your political career, it's amazing how much supposedly committed constitutionalists fall in line. And I'll close with another concept from Weber, which is the bureaucratization of charisma. And this is a place where I put a lot of hope, which is that whatever Trump has, right? We used to say in 2016, we do TV shows and we would say, eventually the laws of political gravity are going to grab Trump. And what we missed was that the laws of political gravity don't apply to Trump, because he was, what we would say at the time was, or we would later say in retrospect, is he was subject to the laws of celebrity gravity, which is a completely different form of physics. And now I think he's transcended the laws of celebrity gravity to the laws of charismatic gravity. And so I don't think he will ever lose, before his departure from this mortal coil, a big chunk of his most rabid following. I think he could shoot people on Fifth Avenue. I think he could have a Lonesome Rhodes moment like in Face in the Crowd, one of the best films ever made about populism and politics, by the way. He could have an open mic moment where he calls all his followers suckers and losers, and it wouldn't affect most of them. But the saving grace here, so to speak, is that attachment is not transferable. And so one of the things that Weber talks about is that with the bureaucratization of charisma, is that what was once upheld in that irrational space of our lizard brains about how much we revere a leader and hold them dear and do what they say and project onto them our hopes and dreams, when that leader goes away, you have to start creating systems and rules and institutions to sustain the political movement or the religious movement that was created. And sometimes that has been done. The Catholic Church, in many ways, is exactly that. It created, in effect, a bureaucracy to support the teachings of Jesus. And it's going well into its third millennium of a good run with that. But more often, what you have is what you had with the Tea Parties, or what you had with Occupy Wall Street, or what you had with William Jennings Bryan, or what you had with all sorts of political figures, is that the inherent contradictions that are central to a charismatic person or leader become hard to sustain, and you get wars for control, wars of succession, right? The different caliphates that emerge after Muhammad. You get the different kingdoms that occur after Alexander the Great. You get some people who just want to perpetuate grift and maximize profits out of it, and there are other people who want to operationalize their heresy or pretend that they can get the old magic back, and they can't. And I suspect that the Republican Party and the American right are due for one hell of a great civil war. I don't mean literally, I mean figuratively, but there are going to be figures from across the right, the religious right, the secular right, the political right, the nationalist right, who are going to hoist their own flags and fight it out. And I'm fairly hopeful that one of the factions that will emerge, that's keeping its head down now because it's terrified and imbued with an enormous amount of cowardice, will be the sort of more traditional, Republican Reaganite crowd that will say, hey, look, we don't have another Trump, so maybe we should go back to those old fusty norms and rules that we once had. I don't think we're ever going to get back in my lifetime to the status quo ante, but I think there's going to be a real movement towards some kind of, correction. And there will be some MAGA people who will be like, this guy was a one of a kind, and we shouldn't try to imitate him. And there are other people who say, aha, the monks from Tibet or from Mar-a-Lago have found the new heir, and there'll be a big fight about it. And, J.D. Vance will be one of those guys trying to claim that, but I don't think his appeal is the same appeal as Donald Trump's, and I don't think anybody's appeal is the same as, I think Donald Trump is, love him or hate him, sui generis. And so I think with a certain historical perspective, looking back on this moment when we're all gone 50 or, whatever years after, we'll say, wow, that was a thing. That was another one of these, intense, populist, semi-mystical, semi-religious moments of a big chunk of people rejecting the powers that be in the establishment and searching for a kind of transcendence that they couldn't find. And hopefully they'll say, and thank God things got back to normal. But maybe not, because nothing is guaranteed. So those are just my thoughts. And again, I want to thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, John. That's great. Terrific. Appreciate it. So we're going to flip to the room in a second. I'm going to take liberty to ask, if I can, a question to you both, because I think one of the through lines, Jonah and Molly, and what you just named was, this line from Jonah that if religion becomes invisible, or if it kind of, gets banned, new symbols will emerge, and that we're built for moral stories, and what was it that Molly said, that secular and religious people really aren't so different. And if we square with a little bit more of that, sort of cogitate on that a little bit more, we might realize that in the broader body politic that you just described, especially on the right, Jonah, but in the broader body politic, the religious insights are still in play. And if we can recognize that the religious insights are still in play, maybe it's an advantage. And so my question is, to a thinker, to a writer, to a politician, to someone who's going to deploy charisma. But my question is, how is that relevant for journalists? Do you think it's relevant that if, in fact, we are a religious people, whether we are functionally religious or not, it is somehow a helpful inside-out tool for journalists?
You're going to me first on that?
Please.
Yeah, so look, I think one of the most enduring problems of American journalism over the last, basically, since the introduction of television, right? Television, more than anything else, introduced this idea, it's sort of like the scientism problem, introduced this idea that journalists could just be objective, and they could just simply describe reality without any bias. And I sincerely think that's impossible. I think the real task is to acknowledge your biases so you can keep them in check. If you know what your biases are, it makes you more aware when your priors are leading you in the wrong direction. And one of the problems that places like the New York Times has had for a very long time, I used to write about how they would write about conservatives as the conservatives in the mist problem, where they would, sort of like Jane Goodall, who would visit gorillas and say, oh, they're so much like us. Look at how, they care for their young. And they would talk about conservatives in much the same way because they didn't know any. And it was even worse when they covered Christians. It was even worse when they covered, religious people in general. And obviously there are exceptions to this, but that was the sort of, that was what came through with a lot of elite journalism was, here are these people with these degrees who all basically went to one or two grad schools who don't understand what the flyover people believe or what motivates them. They can't pass a Turing test for a religious person. And at the same time, they had sort of, because I think Molly is right, we are all, Will Herberg, said that man is homo religio or homo religiosus, that we are born to be religious. We have whether you think it's evolutionary or a divine spark or a little of both, it's an argument for another day, but we have an inherent aptitude towards religion. And when you look at the coverage of climate change, when you look at the coverage of all sorts of secular issues, social justice in general, which it's so funny, social justice is a profoundly religious concept. You cannot conceive of what social justice is as a historical matter without understanding its religious roots. But there was an enormous number of people, and a lot of them are my people, sort of secular Jewish people, who thought just doing good was a substitute for religion, and they were not aware of the fact that they were treating their secular definitions, they were relying on expertise for their secular definitions of doing good, and had a fanatic's faith that no good person could disagree. And so I think that one of the best things that could happen for journalism is just to have more diverse newsrooms. I think Donald Trump's stuff about, there's people in the MAGA world who want basically affirmative action for conservatives on college campuses and college faculties and in newsrooms. I think that's profoundly stupid. But shattering the sort of groupthink problem that newsrooms have in this country is a wholly good thing. Having someone in the room who disagrees with your assumptions about how the world works and says, hey, these quotes you got, they don't really persuade me. Your evidence, I can come up with a better explanation for it than what you're providing here. That's good for journalism. The editing function is, in this decline of faith and trust in experts, the thing that is at the core of it is the destruction of the editing function. What do editors do? Editors tell people, and not just in journalism, but in science and in academia, the basic idea of the editorial function is to say, you're letting your passions get away with you. You don't have the story yet. You don't have the evidence yet. You haven't talked to people who disagree with your premise and who have good arguments for it. Try again. Slow down. Here are here's the hurdles you still have to cross. And that function, in part because of social media, has been dealt an enormous blow. And so it's going to take institutions some real effort and time to recreate those functions, because those functions are necessary in society.
I went to grad school in 2005 because I had this dim desire to be a religion writer, and I felt like there was a lack of nuance and understanding, especially of conservative Christianity at that time. I actually think now we're in a kind of renaissance of religion journalism, and there's a lot of really good people who are coming out of their own complicated backgrounds that involve degrees of insider knowledge and outside study, and there's so much that I really love about how mainstream outlets now cover religion. So I don't think we're in the same place. I will say I think that often journalists have not done a great job in especially covering Trump world at distinguishing between cases where there are false factual claims at work, and cases where, in fact, we could understand the worldview of a particular political constituency if we see that they are organizing and prioritizing data that does have some purchase on reality differently, and that's what's going on. And when I think about the holistic failure, myself included, of the kind of secular intelligentsia to see Trump's election coming, and then to really understand it as it unfolded, I think about the totally hysterical coverage by the New York Times of Trump's often quite flagrant violation of institutional norms, which is fine insofar as it is true, but a hysteria like paired with a complete absence of coverage of the relevant facts and sort of plot lines that help us understand the other half of the country. I mean, I didn't learn until well after it was politically relevant about Hillary Clinton's sort of shenanigans with the Steele dossier and how this was being understood by the right. And I think that there's sort of this imbalance that has contributed to mutual incomprehension, even if it does not stem from a real ignorance of the religious perspective, which I think is pretty well reflected often.
Terrific. All right, let's flip to you. Who has the first one? Leah.
Okay, I think it's on. So yeah, I was just curious about your choice of the term guru for this particular type of people with charisma, and whether you looked at the history of the term in Hinduism and the Indian subcontinent, and like how that kind of related to your use of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are other terms I could have used, and part of my story that I'm telling from the period that begins roughly in the early 70s to the present is tied up with the history of the sort of mostly neo-Hindu movements that get transported to North America. The movement I do a sort of deep dive into is the Divine Light Mission and the Guru Maharaji, and the specific the way in which vocabulary that comes out of that tradition, like the concept of darshan, this encounter that you can hope to have with the guru, where you see the guru and the guru sees you, at least from a distance, really shaped the experience of his followers, even if they very rarely laid eyes on him. But I think in the way in which that tradition, specific to the word guru, in its original context, and in the Sanskrit context, gets reinterpreted and reunderstood in the aftermath of the 1960s revolution in popular American culture and specifically popular psychology, totally transforms its meaning. I'm really interested in, I mean, what Jonah described as the cult of authenticity is such a huge part of both the story of charismatic leaders and the eroding status of institutions, and the way in which most Americans are encountering either the idea of a guru in one of these neo-Hindu movements or a guru in another space where we are kind of borrowing that term, is not premised on kind of submitting to a tradition, seeing that you are, a tiny speck of uninformed matter that needs to really learn before you know what the ultimate good is and can reorient your life. But rather that the key to happiness and flourishing is to see that there is this little flame inside you that is the authentic you, that needs only nourishing and disencumbering of all possible duties and expectations that don't make you feel good. And therefore that is the path to salvation. And indeed, in the case of the Guru Maharaji, I mean, he was importing a sort of universalized version of certain yoga practices and meditation practices. But what he would say to curious seekers, when they would say, how do I know that you are presenting the path of enlightenment? He would say, well, just look into yourself and ask, does this feel like the truth? He had a genius for vibing with the vogue for self-actualization, right? This is the vocabulary that Abraham Maslow is the one who coins this, but it has totally filtered into our vocabulary. And I think in all of these cultural lanes, Americans are being told that they can self-actualize, that is the path to happiness. And in many cases, it's a lie. And they end up deeply disappointed and frustrated by the kind of hamster wheel of achievement that often self-actualization, optimization results in. And I think that actually leaves them more vulnerable than ever to someone who then comes along from the outside and has a story that takes the burden off of you. So to me, there's a specific cultural history to that term guru, but it gets folded into a much broader story that has to do with the history of psychology and the dynamic between individuals and institutions and traditions.
Thank you for walking me through it.
Terrific. Sam Kestenbaum, freelance, most recently in the New York Times. Not quite.
How about that?
Perfect.
Okay. This is a question for Molly, I guess, primarily. So your decision to favor charisma, or you walked us into your methodology, you're thinking through this with first a detour into charm. And I wonder a bit more about if you might say a bit more about that disaggregation. It strikes me as these are, I mean, if we're looking at like etymology, charm is also, right, it's also a language borrowed from mystic or from otherworldly power, or signals that. And I think you described it as like sort of an interpersonal versus the charisma, which you're also defining as like a storytelling. This is sort of another question I'm going to tack onto that, which is that I wonder what also we are to do, or how you've thought about ecstatic experience in all of this as well, which strikes me as, at least in the case of, also in these waters of gifts of the Spirit, are ecstatic experiences. So that's sort of two questions bundled together.
I think charm is a fascinating dynamic in and of itself. I do think it lends itself more to reduction to a formula. Like there are certain things one can do that reliably do result in having a charming effect on a person that you are interacting with. Primarily asking them questions about themselves and putting yourself in the mind that their problems are your problems. And I think there, from Dale Carnegie at least forward, there's a whole tradition of sort of reducing this to a formula. Not that there aren't people who have an instinct for it, but I do think it depends on interpersonal contact. I think charisma is a broader, bigger story. I don't think charm can mobilize religious and political movements, and I'm really interested in those leaders who have mobilized movements. And I'm interested in what makes it possible for this thing, charisma, to travel distances. I mean, as Jonah said, the history of charismatic movements is totally tied up in the history of mass media. And what makes that possible, right, if it is disaggregating the leader from the message? One clarifying point for me in my own research was digging further into the story of Joseph Smith and the founding of the Mormon Church. I was familiar going into that with the source material we have that does give us a vivid sense of what he was like in person. And certainly you can find chronicles from early Mormon converts who remark on his physical appearance, his arresting blue eyes, his powerful handshake, just the sense that he vibrated with the Spirit. But then we know in the early history of the church, there are so many cases of major conversions, especially in the British Isles, hundreds and even thousands of people converting to the Mormon faith, moving their whole lives across the Atlantic to this podunk place on the banks of the Mississippi, Nauvoo, Illinois, never having laid eyes on Joseph Smith. So what then is the bearer of the persuasion there? Well, it's the encounter with the story, of which Joseph Smith is a major character, so I don't think you can remove him from the formula that results in the early success of the Mormon Church. But the actual bearer of charisma is the story that forges the relationship and invites these new converts in. This also helped me make sense of the many primary sources we have that describe him as this incredibly odious charlatan with fat hands, right? Like all the people who heard him make the case and then were not drawn into this movement. So that helped me sort of refocus my lens. I forget the second question that you asked. Ecstatic experiences. So my book is an attempt to tell the story of both charisma in the New Testament in the sense of ecstatic experiences as it is understood and plays out in American history. And why is it that at a particular point, actually exactly the point when Max Weber borrows the term and gifts it to the world of social science, that's exactly the same decade as the Azusa Street Revival launches modern Pentecostalism. I actually don't think it's an accident. I think they are both very different but related modes of critiquing the shortcomings of modernity. and the failure of rational institutions to fully meet all human needs. I mean, Weber is this great secular liberal who loves many of the developments he sees unfolding about liberal democracy, but he's also deeply discouraged by what he famously calls the iron cage of modernity, right? And you read him on charismatic leaders. You get the sense that he's a bit afraid, but he's also like sort of rooting for the charismatic leaders as disruptors who are reintroducing a kind of X factor. And my attempt here is to suggest that in these extremely ecstatic, to secular people, super weird and bananas manifestations of religious enthusiasm, we are seeing a rather universal kind of pre-political yearning that has different, more, sort of staid ways of playing out in other populations, but is not sort of divorced on its own island that requires a certain metaphysics, and that if we begin to see the commonalities between the different ways in which humans seek a place that connects them with transcendent power, the whole picture of American history becomes more legible, and we can stop kind of treating religious history as a sort of ghetto.
That's great.
Can I add one quick thing to that?
Please.
On the question, because on the issue of mobilization, it's sort of like Marshall McLuhan had that line, the medium is the message. The mobilization is sometimes the message, right? It is the sheer fun, the ecstasy of joining, of being part of a movement. There are people who just get caught up in being part of some big thing, some big movement at the moment. And as someone who really is quite a misanthrope and doesn't like large gatherings of humans in almost any context, I'm kind of immune to a lot of that. But one of my favorite lines comes from Eugene Peterson, the Presbyterian theologian and pastor. And he's got this great line where he says, classically, there are three ways in which humans try to find transcendence. Religious meaning, apart from God as revealed through the cross of Jesus. And he lists them. He says, through the ecstasy of alcohol and drugs, through the ecstasy of recreational sex, and through the ecstasy of crowds. Church leaders frequently warn against the drugs and the sex, but at least in America, almost never against the crowds. And I think when you look at a lot of the movements that Molly's talking about, a lot of the happenings, it was the tuning in, dropping out, and and joining a happening that was part of the appeal of the whole thing. And when you see people who go to MAGA rallies, when you see people go to rallies, that line from Obama, "We are the ones we've been waiting for," that pings some people with this idea of being part of a messianic cause where you're all marching in lockstep towards something wonderful, and people get real satisfaction out of that. The problem is that crowds can also be, manipulated in all sorts of bad ways, and that's sort of the story of lots of mass movements.
That's great. How about another Goldberg, Emma from New York Times?
And the two Goldbergs are not related.
Make sure you hit that mic, if you will, Emma. Make sure he can hear.
Oh, sorry. So I had two kind of related questions. One was, Molly, I was really intrigued by what you were saying about Angela Davis and these early examples of gurus who sort of knew the institutions and yet felt betrayed by them. And it called to mind for me what Jonah was saying about how Trump isn't bound by the rules of political gravity because he's really actually bound, formerly by the rules of celebrity, now by the rules of charisma. And it made me wonder what each of you would say about sort of how political leaders, but also journalists and pundits and others kind of make sense of a political system that's now not really operating by the norms or even like the language of politics, but really by the norms and language and rules of spirituality and religion and charisma. And when like two figures can be working together but sort of operating by different kind of norms and rules, how do we sort of navigate that as observers and people covering that system? And then
I find alcohol helps.
Okay, duly noted. And then my other question was, Molly, I was really interested in the question that you raised about like what is this, asking what is the transcendent narrative the leader is offering. And something I was wondering about that is it feels like so often with some of these gurus, there's sort of a dual layered narrative where like there's one narrative where the group of people who really need to be brought in en masse can understand why it's attractive to them, but there's sort of a dog whistle to a broader population that helps them understand like why they would also be safe in that system. So with Trump, I think about like how much of the campaign rhetoric was about nostalgia for the working class and an economic system that no longer works for, kind of rural Americans, working class Americans. And yet there was like sort of subtext that conveyed that billionaires would be very safe in the administration and the tax breaks would continue. So like, how does that kind of dual, and I think about that with Dale Carnegie too. Like when you read that book, it's sort of like the rules for amassing wealth and influence are ostensibly being democratized, but it's also sort of letting rich people know that they accrued their wealth like because of their charm and greatness. So I guess I'm curious how you've seen narratives kind of operate at that dual level. Like, is it two different narratives, or is there like a subtext to the transcendent narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there can be multiple narratives operating in a charismatic leader's set of pitches, but also your question, I think, highlights something important, which is to offer a caveat that charisma does not explain every voting decision by every voter. And I would say many, maybe even most, Americans who voted for Trump, I would not say were part of his MAGA base under the power of a really the explanatory force of a story, but rather had a particular issue that they were activated on, whether it was the legalization of abortion or inflation, their perception that the Democrats are this sort of party with no narrative, and Kamala Harris is the institutional candidate. I mean, what a gift in this anti-institutional moment to the Republicans for the Democrats to nominate the absolute face of institutions, and that so many voted against that story as more than for Trump's story. And I think you have to walk a line that allows for an appreciation of the charismatic relationship without turning it into this master key that then gets you off the hook from a more sort of wonky analysis of specific issues and life experiences, right? While also recognizing that there might be multiple stories that can have a charismatic power, even if I think there's probably one main one. On how journalists ought to cover the system, man, I mean, I think on the one hand, this sounds boring and maybe unimaginative, but you have the straightforward duty of just asserting reality, asserting facts, right? So just because there is momentum behind this political movement that has disdain for the Constitution and the rule of law doesn't mean that journalists should stop pointing out what the rule of law actually is, right? And so I think that's a sort of baseline, and it seems to me that can complement an effort to do what you all do, which is to get into the minds of people who experience the rule of law, not as the guarantor of democracy and peace and civilization, but rather as a giant failed experiment. I mean, I think, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review some months ago, based, I think, on some sociological data that made the point that the average American's experience with institutions, whether it's public health or the justice system and so forth, is an experience with bureaucrats who talk down to them and condescend to them and make life hard for them. And that is actually, when we talk about the system and the breakdown of the system and the breakdown of the rule of law, for many Americans, it's this deeply dysfunctional, condescending system that does not solve their problems and never did. And so, why should they embrace this abstract call to rally to it, right? I mean, it's hard to get inspired about that. But you have to do both, it seems to me.
Wonderful. May I suggest, Jonah, you want to weigh in on this as well? And then after Jonah says something here, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll push from it's East Coast 5:45 to 6:30, our 2:45 to 3:30, and then we'll enjoy this beautiful place. Okay, Jonah?
Yeah, I mean, it's the challenges facing journalism are enormous. I agree with pretty much everything Molly said. I would say one of the things that really concerns me, it's not so much how to do journalism, but one of the most important problems journalism is facing is the decline of local journalism. And in part because for all sorts of reasons that I gather you might have gotten into in other panels and whatnot, Americans are retreating from civic life and experiencing life through screens. And part of the problem with that is that when you experience life intermediated by a screen, it's very easy to treat people you don't like as an abstract other rather than actual human beings. And that's exacerbated when we've nationalized our politics, right? I mean, the whole adage of all politics is local has essentially vanished. And it's not all Trump's fault. Trump is part of it, but also just social media has nationalized our politics in a way that people can get very, 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 very angry at someone living the wrong way 1,500 miles from them, right? We treat people, like Megan McArdle's made this point about how social media makes the entire country feel like a small town where everybody's in each other's business. And I can guarantee you there were people who lived, quote unquote, the wrong way in the 19th century, but most people never heard about it because you didn't have nationalized media. You had your local newspapers. And one of the only things that I think is going to be a real remedy, I mean, I can do chapter and verse on how fixing Congress would fix a lot of our problems, but is for people to realize that they actually only live in the community that they physically live in. That is where most of the important things in their life are going to be coming from. And when there's no journalism to sort of explore that, to sort of build, de Tocqueville talks about how newspapers were at the center of community and building sort of civic institutions. That's kind of gone, and part of it is a problem with capitalism, I'll confess, is it, it nationalizes everything and creates efficiencies. But as an opinion journal, the Dispatch, our philosophy is just basically don't try to conceal what your perspective is, but also don't try to carry water for any party or anything like that. We're right of center, but we're wildly nonpartisan, and some people would just say we're anti-Republican, which I don't think is fair, but it's also understandable. But on the opinion side, I think most journalistic ethics are kind of BS guild stuff. But one thing I believe in really passionately is, and I try to give this advice to young, opinion journalists, is don't lie. Right? Just literally don't say things you believe not to be true. And one of the reasons why I was sort of ostracized by a lot of people on the right was I was so appalled and stunned by the number of people who thought at the end of the day being a conservative meant that it had to be a political consultant for the Republican Party and they had to be party people. And that is one of the things that causes massive distrust. If you're not a party person or if you're a part of the other party, you have really great visibility to partisan BS for the other side and almost total blindness to partisan BS to your own side. And so I'm against having sides. Alexander Solzhenitsyn had this great line. He says, you can resolve to live your life with integrity. Let your credo be this. Let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph. Just not through me. And I believe in the long-term goodness of the American people, and I think our institutions eventually are going to recover or hold and then recover. And one of the problems with populism is that it's a bubble. And in market terms, you never want to be the last money in on the bubble. You want to be there when there's a flight to quality after the bubble bursts. And all populist bubbles eventually burst, or the country goes to hell and never comes back. And so just having some sort of simple rules about what is ethical and moral behavior and about trying to tell the truth as you see it just covers an enormous amount of ground. And even if it's ineffectual in fixing the country, I don't think it's the job of journalists to fix the country. I think it's the job of journalists to tell the truth as they see it. And if you do that, you can at least look yourself in the mirror and feel like you did the right thing. And I think that's sort of enough in life.
All right, terrific. I hope that pricks the conscience in a great way. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 2:45.
So Molly, you gave this example of the 40s through the 60s, the erosion of institutional authority and how that kind of laid the groundwork, I guess, for the rise of charismatic leaders, gurus in that era. I'm wondering if in your work you came across examples of more extreme moments of extreme social upheaval or trauma, and how that sort of laid the groundwork for charismatic leaders to rise. And the reason I ask is because AI has been coming up throughout our conversations today, and you think about like the potential for dramatic and sudden job loss, for even worse outcomes in many people's tellings. So you could see a scenario where that becomes a very fertile environment for a new crop of even more potentially extreme charismatic leaders to arise. So have you thought about that at all, or is there any historical frame that you can provide to look at that?
I think times of especially material immediate crisis that affects people's ability to make sense of their normal routine of survival absolutely leaves people searching for a new narrative to make sense of that. I think it's easy to exaggerate the degree to which you need some sort of cataclysmic national sense of crisis to yield an appetite for charismatic leadership. I think it's actually sort of always there, and there are always subcultures and communities that are feeling bereft in some way and are hungry in some way. But for example, this dynamic came through to me in the early 20th century, a period I call the agitators. I have a sort of ham-fisted typology that I impose on American history. And so the period from the late 19th century up into World War II is the era of the agitators. And one of the first figures I look at is the Pan-Africanist leader Marcus Garvey, right, who comes from Jamaica, founds the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1916, and has for a brief period of years in the late teens and early 20s, based in Harlem, this absolute efflorescence, right? It's the largest black mass movement in history up until that time. And in many ways, I think part of what lends his movement momentum is the fact that the suffering that will become much more widespread across different demographic categories once we move a little bit further into history, into the heat of the Great Depression, is already really being felt in a powerful way earlier by African Americans. And so, I mean, that is, I think, a case in which you can see the way in which the acuteness of material suffering having to do with socioeconomic factors that affect a particular subculture create that hunger in a way that is on the leading edge of what becomes a cultural trend. I do, though, think that it's easy to overestimate our materialism as creatures. I mean, to me, what makes humans more interesting than other animals is that we are so frequently doing things that are actually not in our immediate material interest. And we are capable and, in fact, drawn to abstract thinking and sort of imaginative flights. And there has been, I think, a revision in historians' treatments of some of these religious movements. So there was an early generation of historians of Pentecostalism who cast it as a religion of the dispossessed, told the story of Azusa Street as a story of a bunch of poor people of color who were have-nots and therefore were attracted to this crazy, extreme religious expression. But they've been followed by another generation of historians who have revised that significantly and have found a lot more demographic diversity. Middle-class people seem to have a decent life being attracted to this message. And that is true in a number of sort of millenarian movements and other contexts in which there's been a correction against maybe a generation of historians who are a bit too informed by a Marxist reading of history. The lesson for me is that humans can feel alienated by the universe for all kinds of reasons, not just material ones.
Yeah, I would just add one thing that, I agree with that. I do think, and I know Molly and I had a brief bit of friction about Richard Hofstadter on my podcast, but the concept of sort of status class anxiety it doesn't get the kind of, which is a sort of Hofstadterian idea. Also, Martin Lipset talked about, the extremism of the center. There are a lot of the nationalist and fascist movements occurred in places where you had, Italy and Germany were the last places to urbanize, to industrialize, to nationalize. And there was a sweeping overturning of people's sort of established expectations of what their status was in society, that overlapped with material stuff, but not always necessarily overlapped with material dislocations. And I think that the sense that, the appeal, the sort of demagogic populist appeals that your kind of person is being left behind, right? That you no longer have status, that you are no longer sort of, this country's no longer for you. Those sorts of appeals are at the heart of a lot of the nastiest immigration stuff, at the heart of a lot of these sort of mass movements that, are at their core about this sort of quest for meaning and narrative and all the rest. And I think that we sometimes, because of the overlay of the Marxist stuff, we only really look for it where we see material dislocation, when in fact it can be much more of a social sort of status hierarchy dislocation that's happening in plain sight. I mean, a lot of the middle class people who get radicalized in the 1950s, 1930s, 2020s haven't necessarily gotten materially poorer, but they feel like their status relative to others has been diminished. And that creates a sort of crisis of meaning all unto itself.
We haven't heard from Alejandro Serrano from the Texas Tribune yet. Yes.
This is working. Cool. So I had a question kind of like, anyone from different, we obviously have a diverse group here and probably have different information diets, but going back to, I love the conversation, find it really insightful and thinking about like capital I ideas of charisma and whatnot, but often when I'm writing in like daily journalism, I am at the state level and kind of local, and I kind of find it difficult to weave in some of these concepts, and especially when state leaders are kind of pushing these boundaries, thinking of like Article 1 of the Constitution to justify some of these other policies like surrounding immigration that then trickle around the country. So I'm curious if y'all consume information at the local level and have like ideas or ways to weave in some of these concepts to at least get readers to engage with them and interact with them, because even now, absent that, people feel so strongly that the way they view things is the truth, and they like disagree and have no problem disagreeing. So I don't know, it's kind of frustrating sometimes, but I also feel like in my own writing and sometimes just like in reading state coverage, like a lot of this is lacking, and it's, I think, really important context.
Can I piggyback off of that and just add, like, how much is this like macro idea of charisma mostly applicable to the Donald Trumps and Barack Obamas of the world versus state and local politicians? Like, do you see the lower that you go on the kind of like federalism scale, do you see these sorts of things, the sort of concept not being as salient?
Can I just add?
Please.
Sorry, local news, I get excited. I think we kind of see it on some level with local leaders, especially at like school boards around culture wars. So maybe there's charismatic leaders like Donald Trump sort of inspiring people at a local level. If you can speak a little bit about that, especially as it relates to school boards and culture wars. And I think even some city councils in Southern California really inspired by Trump's narrative and how they sort of, try and, what does that look like on a local level, I guess? Like those policies translating.
One dynamic I would like to add to that is just like, Ross Weiner had a piece in the Atlantic last week. It was terrific. It was all about Mahmoud versus Taylor and what you're describing about the local level. And what is it bending toward? Is it bending toward pluralism? That's basically his argument. But if so, how? How's that actually happen? I think a lot of people who are pluralism scholars will say like it happens really well after a hurricane or after a flood or after a fire, after the Chicago fire. But it doesn't usually happen by itself, So like I like the idea of dropping in, themes that have been raised today. The idea of charisma, it's woven in our history. as part of a larger sort of story of what's happening at the local level. If it's just one paragraph out of 8, that would be one idea. But I hear you basically asking, how do you do it? How do you weave in these big capital I ideas to a practical story?
Yeah, in like lay terms and like make it approachable to someone to like engage critically with it, I guess.
That's a great question, and I in many ways, like a book has a certain structure, and you end up both empowered and really limited, and increasingly you feel just limited by the structure. And so there's a way in which the scope lends itself to cheating toward, I think, figures of more national resonance, right? But I don't think that means that the same phenomena aren't operative on a local level. And it, I think, can have to do with the intersection of national stories, whether it's Trump's or someone else, and then stories that maybe have more, really only make sense on a local level. And I mean, I would imagine that the debates that you are covering over immigration and its effect on a particular community have everything to do with the way in which the people involved understand the history of the community. And there is some interweaving of the national story that they've found persuasive about what's happening to the country, who it belongs to, what borders mean, how to understand crime, this sort of thing, and then perhaps particular transformations that are really a local story. I mean, I wonder if just like as a sort of technique for bringing this into a story, simply introducing a sort of discursive comment from a source explaining how they think about the history of the community, in some artful way, in recognition of your space constraints, but to juxtapose the narrative that your sources impose on the community against the other sources of information that you are bringing in. It seems to me that does present to the reader the power of stories and making sense of these things, and might introduce these interesting cases where there is not perfect synergy between the national Trump story and the local story. I mean, I'm fascinated by Marjorie Taylor Greene's transformation. I mean, the fact that she didn't get his endorsement to begin with, right? Like, there's always been actually some daylight between her resonance in her community and the national story that she has plugged into but is also drawing distance from. And there have to be many, many cases like that where the national story is, there's some Venn diagram overlap, but it's not perfect, and there's indeed some friction.
Yeah, it's encouraging.
Yeah, I mean,
Of all the members of Congress, we have now one. Just kidding. Go ahead, Jonah.
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of federalism, right, of subsidiarity. With the exception of, like, you have to respect civil rights and you have to respect people's right of exit. I'm one of these crazy right-wingers who's totally sympathetic to keeping Austin weird, right? And I want the country to be a more diverse and interesting place to drive across, which has different conceptions about how to live. And so I don't mind super hippie communities, I don't mind super Christian communities, so long as sort of the basic human rights kind of questions are dealt with. It's fine by me. And I think that there's a rich vein of journalism to tap into about whether or not a various state or locality's distinctiveness is being erased and everything's giving way to homogenization. And it's not necessarily a conservative or liberal thing. Like, there's a rich vein of analysis about whether or not all of these chain stores have erased the distinctiveness of downtowns and, like, they're now indistinguishable from any other downtown, or the amount of hypocrisy that one could go after Greg Abbott for in terms of Texas being this champion of state sovereignty and all that, but it's totally fine for us to send our troops to Illinois. You can come across, there are a whole bunch of things that I think addressing the question of whether or not state boundaries are just essentially totally arbitrary now, or whether or not there is something unique about a state or smaller constituency that is bucking a national trend. I mean, it's always fun, it's always useful journalistic, impulse to say, okay, here's a trend. Let's find the 3 examples that prove the trend. Now let's find some examples that disprove the trend. And I think that one of the stories of our national politics is the nationalization of all of our politics. And finding places that are bucking that trend in various and interesting ways, I think is legitimately interesting. But I think there's a potential for a teaching effect, that can tell people, oh, to be a good conservative or to be a good Republican or to be a good Democrat, I don't have to vote on these national issues the same way because it's different where I live and we have different priorities and we have a different conception about what decent our community should be like. And finding those, I think, is a really interesting, way to sort of get at this at a more local level.
Beautiful. How about we go to Lloyd and Sophie?
Thanks to the two of you for sharing these ideas and these thoughts. So I have a question about the capital C charismatics and its influence on lowercase c charismatic. So I'm really alarmed by the language we see very consistently now from Trump, from Stephen Miller, from Kristi Noem, Elon Musk, using not just the term evil, but using the term demonic to describe their political enemies. And the historian of Pentecostalism in me wants to directly go to that as a source. Like, how is it? Because we know Pentecostalism, its emphasis on exorcism and such, that the priority of a spiritual reality is front and center, and always has been since the rise of Pentecostalism. Now, one link we could turn to is the prosperity gospel and the way it inherits from New Age and New Thought, this priority of spiritual reality, but also we could just go more immediate, perhaps, right, to Trump's quote-unquote spiritual advisory board, Paula White Cain, summoning the angels of Africa, folks who are affiliated with the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, Samuel Rodriguez, or even Tony Suarez. I remember Tony Suarez, I was talking to Alejo about this last night, having this revival on the border and praying for an angelic border force to take over of the situation with the border crisis, right? And all that leaves me wondering this participation in this project of Make America Great Again also seems to work so antithetically to Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement's idea of the end time, that we are living in the end times, right? One of the pillars of the Pentecostal charismatic movement, Jesus is a soon coming king. Does that really work if you're trying to do the Make America Great Again? And why is it then that Trump, how is it then that these capital C charismatics that Trump has surrounded himself by, how have they fueled Trump's charisma and making this reality of a spiritual world that we live in so front and center now, especially after the attempt on Trump's life and after the assassination of Charlie Kirk? We saw that language front and center. I'm just really curious how you see that operating, because that seems unusual for politics, especially the demonic part of it.
We were going to take Sophie's question?
Should we or no?
Mine's very different.
Let's go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you asked this. I got really into this very topic in the last part of my research. I think, so there is a way in which, I talked about the charismatic renewal movement. There is a later revival that began in Toronto, the Toronto Blessing in 1994, that sparked an upsurge in especially independent charismatic churches. And in many ways, someone like Paula White was someone who has ridden this revival that is still ongoing and is really a global thing. And it's really complicated, and I think it is so important I find the whole rubric of Christian nationalism to obscure more than it clarifies, because these independent charismatic churches are global. They're networks. I mean, any church that we might lump together under the heading of New Apostolic Reformation is a very network-based, and it's always a global network, right? But it is a story of cosmic battle, for sure. And there's a way in which I think the genius of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, one of the reasons why it is the fastest growing expression of Christianity on earth, is its lively sense of the supernatural, and the way that is interfaced with so many different cultures, right? But there is also this very fractious, anti-institutional, sometimes very ahistoricist, constant revival quality to this stream of Christianity also, that untethers this immediate expectation of supernatural activity and even supernatural warfare from the system of checks and balances and accountability and the sort of ballast of tradition that you have in, say, the manifestations of these same theological ideas in Catholicism. And I think when that becomes married with proximity to political power, it can be very, it's real sort of dynamite politically. I think the eschatological question is really interesting, and I think it is one of the areas that is most frequently misunderstood by outside observers who are sort of magnetized by eschatology, especially in the Christian tradition, and are very attracted to a kind of linear understanding. Surely, this group of people, they believe all these wacko things about prophecy and the Antichrist and the beast and the false prophet, and it's all going to happen in Israel, and this must map, in a one-to-one way into their views of foreign policy. And we know pretty much that this is never true, right? So the great case where this comes through is the Reagan administration, in which you can be 100% certain, as much as we can know anyone's heart, right, that there are people high up in the Reagan administration who had very imminent views of the end times, were absolutely premillennialists, and took this, at least said that they took this prophecy very seriously. So if there was ever an era in American history when you would be looking for the sort of political translation of eschatology into policy, it would be then. And you don't see that at all, right? I mean, if anything, U.S. relations with Israel cooled during that time. We now know that Reagan wanted the abolition of nuclear weapons. He was not trying to sort of urge on this cosmic reckoning, right? And I think there is a similar complexity in the eschatology of charismatic Christians and how the rubber hits the road. So yes, it's true that Jesus might come at any moment, but there's also a sense in which he better not find you sleeping on the job. You better be absolutely doing everything you can to restrain evil and set the table of the world culture such that every person has heard the gospel, right? That is a requirement for the second coming. So that also can get translated into a mandate for serious cultural action in a way that can be understood as still coherent in this view of the end times.
I think that's all really interesting. I would just point out, as someone who's been arguing with friends and former friends on the right for over a decade now against apocalypticism and catastrophism, there's a, sort of getting back to Molly's points from the beginning about how secular people and religious people are more similar than a lot of people assume. There is a whole raft of apocalyptic stuff that is not particularly obviously superficially religious going on the right. Sean Hannity, all those guys were talking about how if Hillary won, it would be the end of America, that we're one election away from the end of America. The Claremont Institute, which I used to be very close with, has lost its friggin' mind on this stuff, and they don't ground it in any sort of Pentecostal language. It is still sort of it's sort of a shadow of Cold War logic that says that these godless, atheist, demon Democrats want to destroy America, and so we have to get them before they get us. That was the disturbing rhetoric, or I should say, that was the rhetoric that most disturbed me in the wake of Charlie Kirk being killed, was the number of people, several Fox News hosts, who said, they've declared war on us, we have to get them or they're going to kill us all, essentially. It was very, Rwanda genocide kind of language of preemption. We have to get them first before they get us. And you can see it, Sean Davis, who's the publisher or the CEO of The Federalist, and I don't want to be too pejorative, but I think he's lost his friggin' mind, during that weird debate about Cracker Barrel and them changing of their logo, he was convinced, and he tweeted about it, that he had this great tweet that was so perfect. he took some screen caps of like some diversity stuff from the corporate website from 10 years ago, and then said, it is obvious that, and this is a very close to verbatim quote, it is obvious that the CEOs of Cracker Barrel hate their customers, hate real America, and are determined to impose on them, quote, gay race communism. And that's just really stupid, but it's also very emblematic of a whole kind of helter-skelter kind of, the war is coming, they're coming after us, they're going to make everybody trans, that kind of thing. And it has an obvious overlay with a lot of the religious, more explicitly religious stuff, but I'm more familiar with the exception of the post-liberal integralists on the Catholic right, I am more familiar with the non-explicitly religious apocalyptic language than I am with the explicitly religious apocalyptic language, because it's much more prevalent in the waters that I sort of been swimming in.
Sophie Hills from Christian Science Monitor. We're not being very feisty, by the way.
My question is, I think, pretty simplistic, but just how do you tell the difference between a charismatic faith leader and one who's not? I don't mean capital C, but a little, between one who is and isn't. Because, going back to the crowd point and the warnings about crowds and kind of groupthink, at the same time, we're having this, in the media and our national conversation, all this discussion about the loneliness epidemic and about community and faith, houses of worship as a place where that naturally occurs. So you could have a group gathering in a faith context that could be the same size as a group that, I just feel like there's some overlap between leaders who are and aren't charismatic and are, I feel like we could fall into maybe a limiting binary where it says that all successful faith leaders with, healthily sized houses of worship are charismatic because they appeal to people and they can connect with people, and then all the others who are struggling to fill their pews are not successful because they're not charismatic?
Right. No, and I don't think that's true. I think you can be an excellent leader and not be charismatic. You can be a great institution builder and a manager of people. And there's all kinds of ways to create organizational culture that don't pivot around telling a story in which you play the leading role. I think there are certain subcultures in American religion in which it is awfully hard to be to grow a big congregation without being charismatic. The genius and the great sort of Achilles heel of American evangelicalism is the way it nurtures spiritual entrepreneurship. And anyone can hang out their shingle, right? It's very hard to grow a big megachurch without some degree of sort of cult of personality, right? Now, I think there's healthy expressions of that, of the charismatic megachurch pastor, whose charisma lies in inviting people into the story of Christianity and plugging them into a whole tradition and submitting his own authority to a reasonable set of accountability structures, right? And then there is the kind of Mark Driscoll version of it that resists all accountability and is really all about a cult of personality. I think charisma is a real thing, but I also think I'm interested in it as a way of understanding history. So sure, there might be a sort of gray area. It's not going to always be a clarifying concept. And I do think it gets especially muddy by the way our language has changed in the era of social media. The fact that you can be as passive as, clicking on someone's Instagram account one time and that makes you their follower, right? That totally dilutes the concept of following. And I do think that it's important to look for a kind of activation in the followers. If we're really trying to figure out what is the difference between charismatic leaders and leaders who just don't rise to that level, do they compel a change of action? And this was part of my own rubric. I was looking for movements that are really doing something in the world. This helps too, I think, in distinguishing celebrity from charisma. There are celebrities who have things to say about politics, right? I've gotten grief from people about why Taylor Swift is not in my book. And, part of it is just like you have to draw the line somewhere, and I kind of was focused on religion and politics. But I think it was interesting, right, that Taylor did, and I'm the mom of a 10-year-old who's a big Swiftie, so like I'm very sensitive to her appeal. And she certainly did weigh into politics. And people made a sort of brief fuss over that, but ultimately it seems to have had no discernible impact, right? She did not create a mass movement. I think people do experience like something like Emile Durkheim's concept of collective effervescence when they go to a Taylor Swift concert. And maybe it's interesting to draw those parallels, but I don't think that it meets the criteria of a charismatic movement.
Yeah, just super quick on that. Like, I remember when I was reading your book, I've only made it halfway through, but I have made it about halfway through, and you describe a certain kind of leadership that is aimed at human flourishing and well-being as opposed to, the amassing power of the charismatic leader. And it made me think of someone who Jonah Goldberg used to call a guru all the time. I mean, he used to always refer to him as a guru, and he kind of had that spirit of sort of like, you'd sit at the feet of this leader and he'd kind of help a little bit. And he wasn't really, it didn't seem like this is Arthur Brooks, who, had a little bit of this sort of gifting. And there was this one politician who came through AEI's building about a decade ago who had run for president unsuccessfully. And he basically said, I know your favorite word. And the fact that I know your favorite word is why I think I could actually elect the president next time. I was like, what are you talking about? And the students were like, opportunity, freedom, I don't know, liberty, what is? And he said, no. Your favorite word is Lloyd. Your favorite word is Sam, or Yusra. And he's like, everybody, Luis, wants to hear your own name in the story that I'm telling as a presidential candidate. And if you can feel like you're part of the story, you might vote for me. And that was interesting. I don't know if that gets at the kind of charisma that you ultimately encourage. Use that mic.
I've only really engaged with her work through like speaking appearances, but Amanda Montell's Cultish, does that have you read or engaged with her ideas, and does it intersect at all with kind of how you're thinking about charisma?
I haven't. What's her big idea?
So it's the idea that, having to sum it up, having not read the book is hard, but that these kind of culty leaders create in and out group through language. I think people who engage more with linguistics, it's not a shocking idea, but yeah, I wish I felt like I could represent it as well to have you engage with it, and maybe I can't.
I wonder, she must be using the word cult with a very specific argument in mind.
Loosely. She says both something like CrossFit can be cultish, as well as things that her dad was in a cult, or something that was, and I can't remember which one, but talks about kind of creating an entirely different kind of language that people in the in-group start seeing themselves and their stories and they're kind of narrating their experiences through this language that's specific to the in-group.
That sounds to me like probably a phenomenon that occurs in a lot of communities that share a certain number of cultural practices and goals. I think we have to be careful about using the word cult. I don't want to banish it from our vocabulary, but I think it's most useful if we understand it in describing a really quite narrow set of communities that make a point of disconnecting their recruits from other people on the outside and making it very difficult to leave, right? And so I've been asked before, is MAGA a cult? And I think that's not a useful way of thinking about Trump's base. And actually, when it's deployed by an outsider, it becomes an excuse to get you off the hook from having to understand people who disagree with you about something. But the broader phenomenon of creating a shared language that is not immediately accessible to other people, I think is very attractive. I mean, as humans, we all crave gnosis, right? We all want access to the secret knowledge that other people don't have. That's an incredibly seductive thing when it's offered to you. And a specialized vocabulary is part of this.
In the time we have left, there's one point I'll be sad if I didn't make it, which is simply that, look, I think charismatic leadership, charismatic movements are neither good nor bad. It depends what the content and the goals of them are. And so like when someone asks, why isn't Taylor Swift in your book? It's like, well, first of all, the whole point of musical artistic performances is to be a little transcendent, is to take you out of yourself, to be part of something, to get swept away. And it's utterly harmless if it's a rock concert. It's the same thing goes with football, right? I mean, like there are people who are insane about their various teams, and it's a huge source of meaning in their lives. And that's fine because they don't leave the stadium and then say, we must have politics that guarantees the Green Bay Packers win every year for all time, right? It's like the pluralism of having different, the pursuit of happiness is an individual right. And that's because some people will define, like for some people being a Marine would be a living hell. And for other people being a Marine would be the highest, best version of themselves. Different horses for different courses. But the fact of the matter is, and Robert Nisbet in Quest for Community is great about this, is that the most likely place to achieve the pursuit of happiness is an individual right, but happiness is most often realized in groups, in family, in community, in business, in church, in fellowship of one kind or another. And we need to have a pluralistic understanding of different institutions and different sources for that kind of meaning. The only place where I am really opposed to charismatic leadership most of the time, not even always, is in national politics. The founding fathers were very fluent on the problems that democracies and republics faced throughout, history. It's one of the reasons why Benjamin Franklin said, a republic if we can keep it, because they wasn't sure that we could, because the history was really bad. And the reason they set up the system the way they did was to, not entirely, but in large part, to prevent the dangers of some faction, charismatic or otherwise, from trying to impose their one best way on the whole country. And the breakdown, the thing that makes demagogic leadership bad, and demagogic leadership is always bad in politics, the reason why it's more of a threat today is because of the breakdown in institutions and faith and trust in institutions that Molly talked about earlier. As long as no one's like abusing anybody in some weird, and I've used weird in a non-pejorative sense, in some abnormal, some strange, some exotic community somewhere where people have the right to the exit, by all means, let your freak flags fly. Do what you want to do. Live the way that you want to live, so long as you respect other people's ways to want to live. The problem with all of this stuff is when it infects national politics and one side becomes, or one team, one faction, insists that the entire nation must conform to some demagogic, charismatic understanding about the role of power and of government. And that's the thing that our system was designed to fend off, and it's failing.
It's a sobering and a great word, maybe, to end on. Anybody else want to weigh in? We got 3 minutes. Molly, a last word?
This was great. We're all ready to go outside.
Hey. Yes. Thank you, Jonah Goldberg. Thank you, Molly Worthen.
Thanks, everybody.